Hello Bio. We're on our last section of chapter 16, and this focus is going to be on the process of speciation. So this is going to be an important word. We're going to get the definition of it here in a second. So this entire section is going to focus on what is speciation and how does it occur. So natural selection and chance events can change the relative frequency of alleles in a population and lead to speciation. So we've talked about over our last two sections how these there can be any random or actual natural processes that cause allele frequencies to change, and when these frequencies change, it can lead to what is known as speciation. And again, speciation, really important word, is the formation of a new species. So it's a pretty simple definition. Based off just looking at it, you could probably tell what it means. So speciation is the formation of a new species, and remember, a species is a group of organisms that breed with one another and then therefore produce fertile offspring. So it's a group of organisms, again, this is important, that breed with one another and produce fertile offspring. So that's like, again, our rabbits in Havana, those are all one species. And let's say somehow something happened, again, we'll talk about any of our other factors that could change and could lead to a split, and now we would have two separate rabbit species, but that obviously is not the case. But I guess a better example could be our red squirrels versus our gray squirrels. But again, we'll get into how they could actually change and form new species. There's some definite ways that it can happen. So there are factors that are involved in the formation of new species, and that's what we're going to take a look at, is what these factors are. And the gene pools of two populations must become separated for them to become a new species. So that is kind of the main overriding cause of forming a new species, is that the gene pools of two populations must become separate from one another. And again, this can happen in various ways, and we call these isolating mechanisms. So they're just ways that organisms become isolated from one another. And so as new species evolve, populations become reproductively isolated from each other, meaning that in terms of reproduction, they're not anywhere close to each other, they're separated from one another. So the reproductive methods are basically different, and that can occur in a variety of ways. And when the members of these two populations cannot interbreed and produce fertile offspring, reproductive isolation has occurred. And so reproductive isolation can develop in a variety of ways. Okay, these three things are going to be really important. So we have behavioral isolation, geographic isolation, and temporal isolation. So we're going to talk about all three of these more in depth, but these are all really important, and they're all going to be important things for us to know. So behavioral isolation occurs when two populations are capable of interbreeding, but they have differences in courtship rituals or other reproductive strategies that involve behavior. So this could be, I think they give an example in your book, that there's two birds, it's like the eastern meadowlark and we'll just call it the meadowlark. They can reproduce, so they are capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. However, the males of the two species sing different songs. So they have different mating calls, and so therefore that is a behavioral thing that leads to difference in reproductive strategies. It's a courtship ritual, and so therefore those two species will never interbreed because their males have different mating songs. So that's our first type, behavioral isolation. Our second type is geographic isolation, and this occurs when two populations are separated by a geographic barrier such as a river or mountain. So this one's kind of really self-explanatory. If two populations are separated from one another, it's going to be impossible for them to interbreed. And so geographic barriers, however, do not guarantee the formation of a new species. So just because there's a group of robins living together on one side of the river, if one flies over to the other side and one stays, it doesn't mean that those two are going to form a new species. So it's just it can happen, but it doesn't mean it always will. And so if two formally separated populations can still interbreed, they remain a single species. So if those robins on the right side of the river and the robins on the left can still reproduce, still interbreed, they will still be the same species of robin. And potential geographic barriers may separate certain types of organisms, but not others. So birds might be a bad example because it's really easy for birds to fly over a river, but let's say if we have a mammal that's not capable of swimming, let's say possum, so a group gets separated somehow, one group gets washed over in a flood, and then the other group stays on one side. So that is how, again, birds might be less affected than other animals would be. That's what that last one is saying. So for our last type of isolating mechanism is temporal isolation. And so again, another thing you're going to need to know this one. And this occurs when two or more species reproduce at different times. So temporal kind of sounds like time. So that could just be if one frog species likes to mate in spring while the other likes to mate in fall. Therefore, they're temporally isolated, so because they reproduce at different times. So knowing the difference between temporal isolation, behavioral isolation, and geographic isolation is all going to be on your test, I can guarantee that. And so our last part of this video today is how we can test natural selection in nature. So it's saying that studies show natural selection in action involved descendants of finches that Darwin observed in the Galapagos Islands. So we've alluded to these before, but Darwin, this is kind of one of his kind of main claims to fame. It was the ability for him to look at these finches that lived in the Galapagos Islands, and the finches that Darwin saw were different, but he hypothesized that they had descended from a common ancestor. So he had, again, if you remember, he thought he only had one finch species originally. He took him to an expert. He said, no, you actually have 13 different species, but they were so closely related that he thought they could have came from one ancestor. But any type of those types of isolation, those reproductive isolation methods could have led to different finches. So if we look, we can look, and we have all different sized beaks here. So we can have this vegetarian tree finch has a parrot-like beak, so to where it's to crush up fruits. Or our large insectivorous tree finch, it eats insects, so it has a beak that's more better for grasping. And then we have a woodpecker finch that, again, it uses insects, and it actually picks up cactus spines, so it has more of a narrow beak just for that method. And then we have our cactus ground finch that has a large crushing beak because it has to just eat part of the cactuses, so it has to crush it up. And then the one that eats seeds, it has a pointed crushing beak. And then we have a large ground finch, so it's going to be kind of roaming on the ground where there's even bigger seeds that have fallen, so it has a very large crushing beak. So all of these finches, different sized beaks, they're different species, however they have descended from a common ancestor. So that's it for our first part of this section. Let me know if you have any questions.